Hi, I'm Jenny Wetzold, and I am going to be doing my presentation on the recovery of alpine herb field on a closed walking track in the Kosciuszko Alpine Zone in Australia. And the authors are Pascal Shearer and Catherine Marina Pickering. So to give you an idea kind of where we're at, I don't know if you'll be able to see it very well, but this is Australia and we're kind of down in the lower southeast section of New South Wales, which is a couple hours south of Sydney, where the mountain is. So in general, alpine environments are some of the rarest environments on the planet. They account for roughly 1% of our landmass, and they're even less abundant in Australia. And they're very fragile, so restoration it takes a lot of patience, a lot of time, and dedication. So this article that I'm reviewing does not have to do necessarily with the doing of a restoration project. It is rather measuring the success of a previous restoration project that was done 15 years prior to the publication of this article. And it's looking at a 4-kilometer track of alpine environment along Australia's highest mountain, Mount Kosciuszko. It's located above Thredbo Ski Village, which is the #1 used. Pretty much it's the only ski resort area that's in Australia, so it's very heavily populated, very heavily used. Or they would have to go to New Zealand. So this research highlights that natural revegetation can take a very long time. Until this article came out, very little was done on the time scale of restoration in an alpine environment. It can take up to centuries. And then continued degradation can and will occur even after human use has ceased. This is because it's a very harsh environment, very high winds, very dry, very cold, and active revegetation can speed up this process and is actually needed in an alpine environment. They also found that non-native species were used in the revegetation of the original restoration project, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit, why that's a significant finding. So the objective was to determine the state of the soils, and undisturbed means the reference site, the natural areas adjacent to the closed track, and the revegetated sites, to see if that 15 years was successful. And they asked 3 questions. How different was the vegetation on the formerly used track to the adjacent natural vegetation? How different were the soils? And basically, what are the trends in the measured environment, plant, or soil characteristics that could possibly explain the variation in recovery between sites along the former track, and thus contribute to our understanding of why some sites or some parts of the track recovered differently than others, or more quickly. And the study area that we're looking at has fairly high precipitation rates. It's roughly 63 inches, or about 5 feet a year. It comes mainly in the form of snow during winter and early spring, and the characteristics of that environment are low-growing shrubs, herbs, and grass species. So this restoration project actually started in the 1960s. The closed track, they closed the former informal track from a chairlift at the top of Thredbo Ski Village to Rawson Pass, which is just below Mount Kosciuszko. And 20 years later, in 1982, a steel mesh walkway was built to alleviate the erosion. And this steel walkway kind of crisscrossed over the original trail. And that closed trail was seeded and mulched. This was to provide vegetation that would alleviate or minimize erosion. And this was mostly done with non-native seeds, which they thought would grow fast and then die off, initially binding the soil together and then leaving open spaces for natives to come back. And the mulching, they spread hay and straw at unknown rates, and then sprayed that with liquid tar to hold that in place, because there's very high winds there. And unlike a lot of the surrounding restoration projects that they did not use fertilizer. And then restoration was stopped. Nothing else happened. They left it alone. So in this article, to measure their success, the success of that original restoration project, they did random sampling of every 5 meters from the overlap of steel mesh walkway and old track, and they got a total of 22 sampling sites. Both of these sites, meaning the natural vegetation and the closed track, were then equally measured in 20 by 20 centimeter sub-quadrants to get percent rock cover, litter, and percent overlapping cover of species. And then they measured soil quality. So statistical analysis and ordinations were conducted to get vegetation height, overlapping species, cover, species richness, shoot frequency, heterogeneity using the Shannon-Weaver index, and evenness using the Simpson's index, as well as soil bulk density, nutrient content, and soil water content. This was to kind of see how that trail reacted or is recuperating from that use and the restoration. And they compared the results of the closed track and the natural vegetation sites to find, naturally, that the vegetation cover on the closed track was vastly different from the natural areas adjacent. So the natural area had far more vegetation, it had higher percentage of overlapping cover and better soil nutrients. That's because there were no non-native species to kind of take out all that already nutrient-poor soil content. And non-native species crowded out the natives and decreased species richness on the closed track, leading to degraded soils. And the conclusion of this restoration in the conclusion the article came to was that the restoration of the 4-kilometer track was found to be highly unsuccessful, mainly because they used alien species, and that caused a whole lot of issues, and also because the bare ground, there was no active revegetation. They just kind of left it alone, which is not something that you can do in that kind of an environment. And that kind of led to a couple questions on my part. My first was that I don't understand why the original restoration project didn't have a reference model. I feel like if you're trying to, even though back then it was a relatively new concept of trying to repair an alpine environment, I feel like you should use the natural vegetation adjacent to the track to speed the process along. And also, as far as this article is concerned, I was curious to understand why they deemed it unsuccessful. Perhaps it could be, they could say that it was not finished, because in this article they pointed out that it takes up to centuries for a restoration project to be completed in an alpine environment. So I just thought that was kind of harsh. But anyway, thank you.